Welcome to i-TUTOR Economics NCERT series. Today we are going to deal with Chapter 2, Indian Economy from 1950 to 1990. On 15th August 1947, India became independent after nearly 200 years of British rule. And the responsibility of nation building fell on Indian leaders. One of their key tasks was to decide what type of economic system would suit India, one that could promote the welfare of all citizens, not just a few. Among the options, socialism appealed most to Jawaharlal Nehru, but he did not support the Soviet-style socialism where the government owned all factories, farms and property. In a democracy like India, the government cannot take over all private properties. In a democracy like India, remember that point, in a democracy like India, government cannot take over all the private properties. Instead, Nehru preferred a system where the government and private sector could coexist to achieve growth and welfare. After India became independent, the leaders had to decide how the economy should work. They wanted a system that would help everyone, not just a few people. Now, you might have heard of capitalism and socialism. Socialism is where the government owns everything, and capitalism is where private individuals owns everything. But India didn't want extreme version of either. So what did they do? Yes, they decided on a mixed approach. That means key industries would be controlled by the government, but private businesses were also encouraged to take part in building the economy. This way, the India could have the benefit of both systems. This approach was reflected in the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948. This policy basically said some industries will be run by the government, some by private companies. At the same time, directive principles of the Constitution emphasized welfare, equality and helping the poor. To make all this work, the government set up the Planning Commission in 1950 with the Prime Minister as its head or chairperson. And this is when the 5-year plan started. These plans were like a roadmap for the country's economic development, guiding how money, resources and industries would grow step by step. Now let's talk about types of economic systems. Basically, every country has to answer 3 questions. What are they? Yes, what to produce, how to produce and for whom to produce. Okay, these are the basic problems of an economy. What to produce, how to produce and for whom to produce. One way to answer these questions is through market forces. How can we answer this question? One way to answer these questions is through market forces, which is called capitalism or market economy. In a capitalist system, whatever people want and can buy is produced. For example, if cars are in demand, factories will make cars. If bicycles are more in demand, they will produce bicycles instead. Even the methods of production depends on what's cheaper. If labor is cheaper than machines, more labor-intensive methods will be used. If machines are cheap, then more machines will be used. But there's a catch. Goods are distributed not based on what people need, but on what they can afford. So, if someone is sick, they get medicine only if they can pay for it. Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, didn't like this system because it would leave the majority of people behind without improving their quality of life. On the other hand, in a socialist economy or in a socialist system, the government decides everything. What goods to produce, how to produce and for whom to produce. Here, distribution is based on needs. Here, distribution is based on needs of society, not on money. For example, healthcare is provided free to those who need it. In strict socialism, there is no private property. The state owns everything. However, after the collapse of Soviet Union, what happened? Yes, after the collapse of Soviet Union and the socialist states in Eastern Europe, strict socialism is no longer practiced widely. Most countries today have a mixed economy, which combines both systems. In a mixed economy, the market produces goods it can go efficiently, while the government provides essential services that the market fails to supply, such as education, healthcare and public transport. So in a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services can produce well, and the government will provide essential goods and services which the market fails to do. Now let's talk about India's 5-year plans. Every plan should have some clearly defined goals. That means things that the government want to achieve over the next 5 years. In India, the main goals of 5-year plans are growth, then modernization, self-reliance and equity. So let's start with the first goal, growth. In the context of 5-year plans, growth means an increase in the country's capacity to produce goods and services. This could happen in several ways. How? Yes, more productive capital, like for example, building more factories or machinery. Better supporting system, like improved transport, banking or communication. And higher efficiency, like using existing resources more effectively. Economists often measure growth using GDP or gross domestic product. Think of GDP as a big cake. It's the total market value of all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. Now imagine the cake growing bigger. If the cake gets bigger, more people can have a share. Similarly, when the economy grows, there are more goods and services available, which allows people to enjoy a richer and a more varied life. So, in simple terms, economic growth is making the cake bigger so that everyone can get a better piece. Now, let's understand where GDP comes from. The GDP of a country is not just one number. It comes from different parts of the economy, which we call sectors. What all sectors are there? Yes, agriculture sector, industrial sectors and service sectors. Agriculture sector includes everything related to farming, crops and livestock. Industrial sector includes factories, manufacturing, mining and production of goods. Service sector includes things like banking, education, health, IT, transport and so on. Each sector contributes a share to the total GDP. The combination of contribution from agriculture, industry and service is called structural composition of the economy. Now, here is an interesting point. In some countries, the growth of agriculture drives the GDP because most of the population is dependent on farming. In others, the service sector may be the main driver, like in countries like strong IT, banking or tourism industries. So when we talk about GDP growth, it's important to see which sector are contributing more because that tells us a lot about how the economy is structured and where the development is happening. Now let's talk about modernization. Modernization basically means using new technology to produce goods and services. Let me give you some examples. On a farm, a farmer can increase crop yields by using new seed varieties instead of old ones. In a factory, production can be increased by using modern machines instead of old type of machines or less efficient ones. So whenever producers adopt better methods, tools or technology to make more and better products, we call that as modernization. In simple words, modernization is about making things more efficient and productive using innovation and technology. Now, modernization is not just about machines and technology. It also includes changes in society and our way of thinking. For example, in a traditional society, women were expected to stay at home while men went out to work. But a modern society recognizes the talents and potential of women and allows them to work in banks, factories, schools, etc. and like other places. By including women in workforce, society becomes more fair, civilized and prosperous. So modernization is about both improving technology and improving social attitudes. Now let's talk about self-reliance. A country can grow and modernize by using its own resources or by relying on resources from other countries. In the first 7 5-year plans, India focused on self-reliance. This meant producing goods within the country instead of importing them from abroad. Why was that important? Well, India had just gained independence, so it was natural to reduce dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. They was also concerned that relying too much on imported goods, technology, or capital could make India vulnerable to foreign influences in its policies. So, self reliance was both an economic strategy and a matter of national security. Now, let's discuss equity, which is the fourth goal of 5-year plans. Even if a country achieves high growth, develops modern technology and becomes self-reliant, it doesn't automatically mean that everyone's lives improves. Imagine a situation where the economy grows, but most people remain poor. Then the growth isn't really benefiting the majority. That's why equity is important. It means that the benefit of economic prosperity should reach all sections of society, especially the poor and not just the rich. Equity ensures that every Indian can meet their basic needs like food, housing, education, and healthcare. It also aims to reduce inequality in the distribution of wealth so that prosperity is shared fairly. Now that we have understood the four main goals of 5-year plans, what are they? Growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. Now let us see how the first 7 plans covering the period from 1950 to 1990 tried to achieve these goals. We will look at different sectors of economy, agriculture, then industry and trade, and understand the extent to which these plans were successful in fulfilling the objectives. This will help us see what worked well, what challenges remain, and how India's economy gradually transformed during these 4 decades. Before we dive into the details of first 7 5-year plans, let's take a moment to look at an important personality behind India's planning. Who is that? Yes. Who? Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis or Mahalanobis. Mahalanobis was a statistician and his ideas played a key role in shaping India's economic planning. While planning formally started with the second 5-year plan, it was Mahalanobis' concept that laid down the basic framework and goals of India's planning. Because of this, he is often called Architect of India's planning or Architect of Indian planning. He also established Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta and started a journal called Sankhya, which even today is an important platform for statisticians and economists around the world. So Mahalanobis not only influenced India's economic plans but also left a lasting contribution to global statistical research. Now, let's look at the service sector and its role in Indian economy. As a country develops, India usually goes through what economists call structural change. This means that the way different sectors like agriculture, industry and service contribute to economy changes over time. Typically, as countries develop, the share of agriculture declines, industry grows, and at very high levels of development, the service sector becomes the largest contributor to GDP. India's case is interesting. In 1950, more than 50% of India's GDP came from agriculture, more than 50%. But by 1990, something unusual happened. The service sector contributed about 40.59% of GDP, which was more than agriculture or industry, a pattern we usually see in developed nations. This growing share of services became even faster after 1991, when India began economic liberalization and opened up its economy. So even before India became a fully developed country, its service sector was already playing a dominant role in economy. Now let's continue step by step. We will study the first 7 5-year plans, that is from 1950 to 1990, and see how India tried to achieve the 4 goals: growth, modernization, self-reliance and equity. Now, agriculture after independence. Remember how during colonial times agriculture in India was stuck. Yes, low productivity, unfair distribution and no real growth. Most farmers were poor and land ownership was highly unequal. After independence, Indian policy makers focused on fixing these problems. They introduced land reforms to make sure farmers had more secure ownership of land and could benefit from their work. Another major step was the introduction of miracle seeds. Miracle seeds, high yielding varieties of seeds that produce more crops per acre. This led to Green Revolution. Which dramatically increased food production in India and helped move the country closer to self-reliance in food. Now, land reforms after independence. At the time of independence, India's land system was unfair. Most farmers who actually worked on land didn't own it. Instead, intermediaries like Zamindars or Jagirdars collected rent from them but did nothing to improve the land. Because of this, agriculture was unproductive. And India even had to import food from USA to feed its people. To bring equity in agriculture, the government introduced some reforms. This meant changing who owned the land. Just a year after independence, laws were passed to abolish intermediaries and make the actual tillers the owners of the land. Why was this important? Yes, ownership gave farmers incentives, meaning they were more likely to invest time, effort, and money to improve the land if they knew they would benefit from it. Of course, they also need access to capital like money, tools, seeds, etc. to make those improvements. Now, land ceiling policy. Another important step to bring equity in agriculture was the land ceiling policy. So, what does this land ceiling mean? Yes, it simply means setting a limit on the amount of land a person can own. Why was this needed? Before independence, a few people owned huge amounts of land, while most farmers had very little or none. By fixing a maximum limit, the government aimed to reduce this inequality and ensure fair distribution of land among farmers. Now, abolition of intermediaries and its impact. After independence, one major reform in agriculture was the abolition of intermediaries. Now, what does this mean? Previously, tenants had to pay rent to Zamindars who did nothing to improve the land. The tenants were often exploited and had no security. With abolition, about 200 lakh tenants came into direct contact with the government. This means they no longer had to deal with the exploitative Zamindars. Ownership given to tenants motivated them to work harder and improve the productivity, which helped growth in agriculture. But the reform did not fully achieve equity. Why? Some former Zamindars found loopholes in the law and continued to own large tracts of land. There were cases where tenants were evicted and landlords claimed that they were self-cultivators to retain ownership. Even when tenants got land, the poorest agricultural laborers like sharecroppers and landless laborers did not benefit from it. So, while abolition of intermediaries was a step forward, it didn't completely solve the problem of inequality in agriculture. Okay. Now, land ceiling legislation. Another major step to promote equity in agriculture was the land ceiling policy. So, what is land ceiling? It means fixing the maximum size of land that an individual can own. The idea was to reduce concentration of land in a few hands and allow more people to benefit from the land ownership. However, implementing this policy faced many hurdles. Big landlords challenged the law in court, delaying its enforcement. Some landlords registered their land in the names of relatives to escape the law. Loopholes in the legislation were exploited to retain large tracts of land. The success of land reforms varied across states. Some states like Kerala and West Bengal were successful because their governments were committed to land to the tiller policy. Unfortunately, in many other states, lack of political commitment means that inequality in landholding continues every day. In short, land ceiling aimed to make agriculture more equitable, but its success depends heavily on strong implementation and political will. Now, agriculture reforms and the Green Revolution. At independence, India faced serious challenges in agriculture. About 75% of the population depended on farming, but productivity was very low. Farmers were using old methods, had little access to irrigation and depended heavily on the monsoon. So there were abolition of zamindars, you had already told it. Before independence, systems like zamindari system mean that intermediaries collected rent from actual tiller without improving the land. After independence, these intermediaries were abolished and the tillers were made owners of the land. Ownership gave farmers incentives to invest in their land, which helped increase agricultural output. However, equity was not fully achieved because some former zamindars used loopholes to retain land and the poorest farmers still did not benefit. Land ceiling means fixing the maximum size of land an individual could own. This aimed to reduce concentration of land in very few hands, but the law faced hurdles. Landlords challenged in its courts. Some registered lands in relatives' name. Loopholes were exploited. States like Kerala and West Bengal successfully implemented land reforms, while other states lagged, leaving inequality in land holding. Then, despite reforms, productivity needed a major boost. This came with the Green Revolution, which introduced high-yielding variety seeds for wheat and rice. High-yielding variety seeds required proper use of fertilizers and pesticides, reliable irrigation, financial resources to purchase inputs, and so on. So the first phase from mid-1960s to mid-1970s benefited many affluent states like Punjab, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, focusing on wheat growing regions. The second phase from mid-1970s to mid-1980s saw wider adoption across more states and crops. Result was India achieved self-sufficiency in food grains and no longer depended on imports to feed the population. Now, increasing agricultural output is great, but it's not enough by itself. Okay, let me explain why. If farmers consume most of what they produce themselves, the extra output doesn't really help the economy as a whole. The part of the produce that farmers sell in the market is called market surplus. During the Green Revolution, a good portion of wheat and rice was sold as market surplus. This had two important effects. What were they? Yes, food prices declined relative to other items. Food prices declined relative to other items. This was especially helpful for low-income groups who spend a large portion of their income on food. And also, the government could procure enough food grains to maintain stockpiles, which could be used during shortages or famines. In simple terms, the Green Revolution didn't just increase production, it ensured food reached the market, helped people afford it, and secured the nation against its hunger. Now, while the Green Revolution brought huge benefit to India, it was not without risk. Let's look at the main concerns. The technology required inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and HIV seeds. Initially, only big farmers could afford this. So, there were a fear that small farmers would be left behind. Then, high-yielding variety crops are often more vulnerable to pest. They are often more vulnerable to pest attack. So, small farmers, if attacked by pests, could lose everything. But here's a good news. The government stepped in to prevent these risks. Loans at low interest rate were provided to small farmers. Fertilizers were subsidized to make them affordable. Research institutes offered guidance to reduce crop losses from pests. Because of these measures, small farmers could also access HIV technology, and over time their output matched that with big farmers. The benefit of Green Revolution were shared by both rich and small farmers. So the key point was the Green Revolution would have mainly helped the rich if the government had not actively supported small farmers. Now, the debate over subsidies in agriculture. Subsidies were crucial during Green Revolution, especially for small farmers. Why? Yes, farmers may be hesitant to adopt high-yielding variety seeds, fertilizers and irrigation techniques because they are uncertain if it will work. Government support through subsidies reduced this risk, encouraging farmers to try the new technology. So, however, today subsidies are hotly debated. Let's see why. Once a new technology is proven profitable and widely adopted, some economists argue that subsidies should be gradually removed. And fertilizer subsidy benefit the fertilizer industry as well as farmers. Among farmers, prosperous regions benefit more while poorer regions may get little advantage. That means unequal benefit. Then, continuing subsidy costs a lot for the government and may not help the intended small farmers effectively. That means financial burden on government. So the key takeaway is subsidies were necessary initially to make the green revolution successful, but in the long term they continued use its question due to uneven benefit and financial strain. Not everyone thinks subsidies should be removed. Not everyone believes that subsidies should be removed. Some experts argue that farming in India is still a risky and difficult job. Still it's risky. Okay, especially for small and poor farmers. Why subsidies are still needed? Many farmers cannot afford the essential inputs like seeds, fertilizers and irrigation without government support. Removing subsidies would increase inequality between rich and poor farmers, going against the goal of equity. So how to fix this problem? If subsidies currently benefit many fertilizer companies and large farmers, the solution is not to abolish subsidies. Instead, the government should target subsidies carefully, making sure that only poor farmers get the benefit. So, the key takeaway is subsidies are a tool to protect the small farmers and promote equity, but they need to be well targeted to serve the intended beneficiaries. By the late 1960s, India had made a big leap in agricultural productivity, thanks to the Green Revolution and land reforms. For the first time, the country became self-sufficient in food grains. For the first time, our country became self-sufficient in food grains, which was a remarkable achievement after years of dependence on imports. This is something every Indian can be proud of, but there was a problem. Even by 1990, about 65% of India's population was still working in agriculture. Normally, as a country grows and becomes richer, fewer people work in agriculture and more work in industry and services. This is because productivity increases. Fewer farmers can produce more food. Between 1950 and 1990, what happened? The share of GDP from agriculture declined, but the number of people dependent on farming hardly fell from 67.5% to 64.9%. Why did this happen? The industrial and service sector did not create enough jobs to absorb people living in agriculture. Economists considered this as a major policy failure during 1950 to 1990. While production grew, employment did not shift to other sectors as it should have. India succeeded in producing enough food, but structural transformation of the workforce lagged behind, keeping too many people tied to farming. Now, economists often say the poor countries can develop only if they have a strong industrial base or industrial sector. Why? Because industry provides stable environment. Unlike farming, industrial jobs are less dependent on season and weather. And industry promotes modernization. It brings in new technology, better methods of production and skilled workers. Industry contributes to overall prosperity. That means more production means more goods for people, more exports and higher GDP. This is why India's 5-year plan focused heavily on industrial development. At independence in 1947, India's industrial base was very limited. Most industries were small scale or handicraft based. There were cotton textile mills and jute mills. Only a couple of large, well-managed iron and steel firms existed, one in Jamshedpur, that is Disco, and one in Kolkata. Clearly, India needed a much wider variety of industries to support economic growth, provide more jobs, and reduce dependence on agriculture. After independence, one of the biggest questions for India's policymakers was, what should be the role of government and the private sector in building industries? Let's break this down. Challenges for Indian industry in 1947. Indian industrialists did not have enough capital to invest in big industrial projects. Even if some had money, the market was too small, meaning there weren't enough customers to make a big industry profitable. Because of these limitations, the government had to take lead in building industries. Also, India had decided to follow socialist principles, meaning the government wanted to control the most important sector to ensure the country's growth and self-reliance. The second 5-year plan introduced the idea of state controlling the commanding heights of the economy. State controlling the commanding heights of the economy. This means the government would manage industries vital for national development like steel, power, heavy machinery and mining. Private industries were encouraged, but their role had to complement the public sector. The public sector led the way while private business filled in the gaps where possible. So in short, state is the leader in building key industries. Private sector supported growing alongside the public sector. This approach aimed to kickstart industrialization while ensuring equity, growth and self-reliance. After we decided that the state should control the key sectors of economy, the government formalized the idea through the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 or IPR 1956. This policy became the foundation for the second 5-year plan, which aimed to establish a socialist pattern of society in India. So let's understand it step by step. The main goal was to clarify which industry the government would run and which the private sector would handle. This helped reduce confusion and guided investment and planning in a structured way. And classification of industry, when we talk about the classification, the policy divided industries into 3 categories. What are they? Yes, exclusively state-owned industries, then mixed responsibility industries and private sector industries. Exclusively state-owned industries means these were industries vital for national development like defense, heavy machinery, atomic energy and railways. Only the government could own and operate this. And mixed responsibility industries means industries where the private sector could participate, but the state would take primary responsibility for starting new units like steel, heavy chemicals, mining and so on. Private sector industries means the remaining industries, mostly like consumer goods, were left completely to private businesses. The state would only step in if necessary. So, state is a leader in crucial industries and private sector is a partner in some industries and independent in others. This system ensured planned industrial growth, avoided duplication and balanced economic development with social goals. Even though some industries were left to the private sector, the government wanted to ensure that private businesses aligned with national development goals. So, a system of licenses was introduced. Let me break down a system of license. So, license requirement. No new industry could start without getting a license from the government. This allowed the state to monitor and guide private investment. And second one, promoting backward regions. The policy encouraged industries to set up in economically backward areas. Easier licenses and special concessions were provided to units in these regions. Concessions include tax benefits and lower electricity tariffs. Then, the main purpose of the policy was to reduce regional disparities. By guiding industries to less developed areas, the government tried to create jobs and promote balanced regional development. So, in short, private sector existed but under state oversight. License policy was a tool to ensure growth in the right sector and regions. This approach helped India move towards a planned and balanced industrial growth. Now, it wasn't just new industries that needed government permission. Even existing industries had to obtain a license if they wanted to. For expanding production, produce more of the same goods, and for diversifying production. Why was this needed? Yes, the government wanted to make sure that economy didn't produce more goods than required. And expansion or diversification was allowed only if the government believed that was real demand in the economy. So in simple words, think of government as a traffic controller for industries. No industry could speed ahead or make extra out products unless the economy needed them. This helped avoid wastage of resources and ensured planning growth. Now, back in 1955, a committee called the Village and Small Scale Industries Committee looked at how small industries could help rural development. Village and Small Scale Industries Committee. What is a small scale industry? Yes, a small scale industry is defined based on how much money is invested in the unit's assets. In 1950, the limit was rupees 5 lakh. Today it is 1 crore. So, why focus on small industries? There are labor intensive, which means they use more workers relative to capital, creating more employment. However, small industries cannot compete with big industries on their own. How did the government help them? Some products were reserved only for small scale industries, so big firms couldn't enter that market. And lower excise duties are also given. Bank loans and lower interest rates are also given. So, in simple terms, think of small scale industries as the backbone of rural jobs. The government protected and supported them so they could grow without being crushed by big companies. Alongside industrial policies, India's trade policy during the first 5-year plan followed what we call an inward looking strategy. What does this inward looking mean? Inward looking mean? Yes, it means the country focused on producing goods within India instead of relying on imports from either countries. Technically, this is called import substitution. What this is called? Import substitution. Okay, import substitution. The idea was simple. If India was importing vehicles, machinery or consumer goods, domestic industries would be encouraged to make them locally. This way, India could reduce dependence on foreign countries and promote domestic production. How did the government protect the domestic industries? Yes, through tariffs and quotas. Tariffs means a tax on imported goods, making them more expensive than Indian products. Quotas means a limit on the quantity of goods that could be imported. So effects of tariff and quotas are imported goods become less attractive to buyers, domestic firms were protected from foreign companies, and this gave Indian industries a chance to grow and strengthen before facing international competition. So in simple words, imagine you have a small ice cream shop in your town. If cheap ice cream trucks from another city come in, they might take away all your customers. So the government's tariff and quotas are like rules that give your shop a fair chance to grow before competing with big trucks from outside. So the protection policy or the policy of protection through tariffs and quotas was based on simple idea. Industries in developing countries like India in 1950s cannot compete immediately with industries in developed countries which are more advanced and efficient. So if domestic industries are protected from foreign competition, they get time to grow, improve and eventually learn to compete on their own. And another reason for protection was planners worried that foreign exchange could be wasted on luxury imports like foreign cars, perfumes or electronics. So by restricting imports, India could save its foreign exchange for more essential goods and development purposes. So what about exports? In mid 1980s, India did not focus much on promoting exports. The main aim of trade policy was to develop domestic industries, not to sell Indian goods abroad. So in simple terms, think of India's industry as a young athlete learning to run. If you immediately make them compete with a professional runner, they will fail. So protection acts like training wheels, helping the athlete grow strong before facing tough competition. Now, let's see how India's industrial policies actually worked and what they achieved. In 1950 to 51, the industrial sector contributed only 11.8% to India's GDP. In 1990 to 91, this had risen to 24.6%. This is a big jump, showing that India's industries were growing and becoming a stronger part of economy. The industrial sector grew at about 6%. Industrial sector grew about 6% per year during this period. For a developing country just starting after independence, this is commendable. Earlier, Indian industry was mostly limited to cotton, textiles and jute. By 1990s, what happened? Thanks to public sector, industries were much more diverse, covering areas like steel, chemicals, electronics and automobiles. And policies supporting small-scale industries allowed people without large capital to start business. This created more employment and helped many people become entrepreneurs. So industries were shielded from import through tariff and quotas. This gave homegrown industries like electronics and automobile sectors. Without such protection, these industries might not have survived against established foreign companies. So in short, policies were successful in growing the industrial sector, creating jobs, diversifying industries and promoting self-reliance. Now, public sector achievements and criticisms. Role of public sector. After independence, the public sector played a crucial role in building industries and promoting economic growth. It helped establish heavy industries. Other infrastructures and other areas where private investment was not sufficient. Some economists argue that many public sector enterprises underperformed. Initially, the public sector was needed in a big way, but later it continued producing goods and services even when the private sector could do the same. An example of overreach is telecommunication. I'll just look at an example. The government had a monopoly for decades in telecommunication services. As a result, people had to wait years to get a phone connection. Private companies could have provided faster services. So a government-owned bread company was set up even though private companies could make breads. It was later sold to private sector in 2001. So the main issue was there was no clear distinction between what only the public sector should do and what the private sector can also do. Where the government should focus is the state should concentrate on services that the private sector cannot provide, like national defense, free medical care for the poor, and so on. For areas where the private sector is capable, like hotels, bread production, or phones, the government can step back to allow competition which improves efficiency and reduces waste. In short, the public sector was essential initially, but over time, state intervention in areas manageable by private firms led to inefficiency. Economists suggest focusing government resources on what is uniquely its responsibility. So now losses in public sector firms. Huge losses. The problem, many government-owned firms continue to operate even while incurring huge losses. Why? Because closing a government enterprise is extremely difficult. There are political, social and administrative hurdles. Second reason was contrast with private firms. Private firms cannot survive if they keep losing money. They either shut down or restructure because owners need to protect their investment. Some public sector firms were originally private firms on the verge of closure, but the government nationalized them to protect workers' jobs. So the key point is public sector enterprises can sometimes continue to function even if they drain national resources, whereas private firms are forced to be efficient or close. So in short, the public sector can sustain unprofitable firms for social and political reasons, but this can lead to inefficient use of resources. In contrast, private firms operate under market disciplines and cannot ignore losses. Now, the license raj and its misuse. What was the license raj? After independence, to start a new industry, entrepreneurs had to obtain a license from the government. This was meant to control production, avoid overcapacity, and promote balanced industrial growth. So, how it was misused? Some big industrialists obtained licenses not to start new firms, but to block competitors from entering the market. This prevented healthy competition and allowed a few big players to dominate certain sectors. So the consequences were excessive regulation led to what became known as permit license raj system. Industrialists spend more time lobbying for license than improving products, technology or efficiency. As a result, innovation and productivity suffered, slowing down industrial growth. So what are the criticism of protection from foreign competition? Protection from foreign competition is also being criticized. How? Yes, what was that policy? To promote domestic industries, India restricted import through tariff and quotas. This was called protectionism, and the idea was to shield Indian firms from competition until they become strong enough to compete globally. So even after domestic industries had grown, protection continued. Indian consumers had no choice but to buy what local producers made because of foreign goods were restricted. And the effects on producers were, producers knew they had a captive market and no competition, no incentive to improve quality. They could sell low quality goods at high prices without worrying about losing customers. So why competition matters? Competition from imports encourage producers to be efficient, innovate and improve quality. Without it, industries risk stagnation and efficiency, hurting consumers. Now, public sector protection and need for policy change. The public sector is not only about making profit. Its main role is to promote welfare of the nation. For example, providing essential goods, employment, and services that the private sector may not deliver. Therefore, public sector firms should be judged by how much they help people, not just by their profit. Some economists argue that protection of domestic producers is necessary as long as rich countries protect their own industries. This helps Indian industries grow and compete internationally. There were conflicts between goals of profit, efficiency, and welfare. Issues like license raj, overprotection, and inefficient public sector firms created economic inefficiency. Due to these problems and conflict, economists suggested a new approach to economic policy. This led to introduction of new economic policy in 1991, making a shift towards liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So the key takeaway is, while the public sector and protectionism saved important roles in early decades, inefficiencies and changing global conditions necessitated reforms in India's economic policy. Now, conclusion. India's economy from 1950 to 1990. When we look back at the first 7 5-year plans, we can see that India made significant progress in many areas, like industrial development. Our industries become much more diversified compared to independence, moving beyond just cotton, jute, and a few steel plants. The public sector played a key role in promoting industrial growth. Then, agriculture progress. The Green Revolution enabled India to achieve self-sufficiency in food production. Land reforms helped abolish the exploitative zamindari system, giving farmers ownership and incentive to improve productivity. Then what were the challenges? Many economists were dissatisfied with the performance of some public sector enterprises, which often continued to run despite being inefficient. Excessive government regulations like license raj limited entrepreneurship and innovation. Protection from foreign competition, though meant to promote self-reliance, sometimes reduced the incentive to improve quality. Our policies were largely inward-looking, which means India did not develop a strong export sector. So there is a need for reforms. With the changing global economic environment, it became clear that India's economy needed reforms to increase efficiency. This led to the introduction of new economic policy in 1991, which focused on liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So that's all about this chapter. Hope you understand. Thanks for watching. For more related contents, do like, share, and subscribe.